everyone, and welcome to episode 189 of the Medieval Podcast, or episode 0 of Extra Medieval. I'm Danièle Sapolsky, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. That's right, I am a child of the 80s, and if there was one thing that we loved in the 80s, it was a crossover episode. This is my 4th year of doing the Medieval Podcast, and something that I've noticed is that every week there is something extra that I didn't get to talk about. So I'm creating a new podcast called Extra Medieval, and this episode is going to be a taste of how that is going to go. Unscripted, unedited, just the real thing, just real geekery time with you and me. So for a preview of Extra Medieval and this week's episode of the Medieval Podcast, stay tuned after the break. So I'm creating this new podcast and I'm calling it Extra Medieval for a few reasons. The first one being, as I mentioned, every time I finish an episode, I'm like, oh, there's something else I wanted to talk about, something extra. And so every week on Extra Medieval, I'm going to be talking about something extra. Then the other reason, one among many reasons, is that I rarely get to talk about articles when I'm doing the Medieval Podcast. That podcast mostly lends itself well to books, a full-length monograph. And so that's mostly what I feature. But some of the most exciting stuff that's happening is happening in journals and articles. So another reason to create a new podcast is to talk about articles. The third one is that one of the things that I love to do is to make connections between our world and the medieval world. So extra in this case might also mean extra as an outside of the medieval world. I get to talk about books that have a connection to the medieval past. And then finally, it might be because I'm being a little extra on this because I have so much enthusiasm for this. It can't be contained in just one podcast. This is all the reason why I'm calling it Extra Medieval. And one of the challenges for me is going to be doing this unedited, unscripted, and also on video. This is something that I want to practice, something that I want to keep doing. So if you're watching this on video, you're seeing me for the first time doing a podcast on video at the same time. Some things are going to be different. If you follow me on the Medieval Podcast, this is going to be a little bit different in that it's not going to be interviews. It's just going to be me chatting as if I'm giving a lecture or just blasting you with information in a coffee shop. So that's going to be new. Also, the unedited, unscripted thing and video. See, this unedited business means you get to hear my papers as I move them around and remember what I'm about to say. The other difference is that Extra Medieval is going to be subscription-based. And I like being transparent about the way I do things because a lot of people ask me how I do the podcast because they may be medieval up-and-comers that want to do it themselves. So I'll be transparent with you here about why Extra Medieval is going to be subscription-based. And again, I'm going to have a list for you, right? I love lists. 1, 2, 3, all those bullet points. The first one is that creating a podcast is a lot of time and effort. If you've ever tried to create one or if you imagine yourself creating one, you know there is a lot that goes into it, from the planning to the research to the actual time to record to the time to edit or upload or all of those things. And I think that it's important for me to be able to keep doing this, to be able to do it in a sustainable way as a professional. I still want to have a free podcast, which is the Medieval Podcast, so that anybody anywhere can access that at any time. But if I'm going to do extra, I'm going to need to have it be subscription-based. The other reason is because I know that people are looking to me in some cases to figure out how they want to fulfill their own careers and how they want to make that work. I want to be a good example. And being part of a good example is being someone who says hard work is work that should be paid work. So often in the gig economy, we are asked to do things like write articles for free or do podcasts for free. And so I'm actually doing this in part to model, hey, it's okay to ask for a subscription when you're putting in the hard work. So that's another reason. And then one reason I think is really important is there will be fewer trolls if you have a gate. There are always going to be people who are giving you trouble for the things you say. But if I'm going to be talking about a wide range of things every week, it's going to be easier for me to feel confident doing that if I have just one layer between me and the trolls. Because like everyone else, I'm a fragile human and I need my confidence if I'm going to be speaking about things like that. The good thing about having a subscription community is that it can be personal. It can be space where I can talk to you in a way that is maybe like letting my hair down. And if you are watching this on video, you know that that's kind of a weird phrase for me to say because I have very little hair to begin with. So I'm going to be charging for Extra Medieval $3.99 per month American, because that's, I think, the easiest for everyone rather than try to figure out how to do this in Canadian dollars. I'm going to offer it on Apple, Spotify, and Patreon. So if you are above the $10 level in Patreon, you're going to get this anyway. And then you can add yourself to Patreon if you want to subscribe and get Extra Medieval and the video. So I've told you all about how the format is in terms of it's going to be subscription, it's going to be unedited, it's going to be like this, me just ranting on and maybe having all my verbal tics and paper sounds and all that stuff, airplanes in the background. But I think that there's something beautiful about that sort of authenticity, that rawness. And I think people in the podcasting space enjoy that. So if that's your jam, maybe Extra Medieval's for you. So let me give it a try. Let me pilot this for you. What is it going to be like in a regular episode of Extra Medieval? Well, something I've been thinking about talking about extra that I didn't get to talk about on the actual Medieval podcast is talking about Natalie Goodison's work on swans. So I know that her recording quality wasn't the most amazing. We are always victims, in some cases, of our internet quality. And sometimes the quality is not very good. I think we recorded that one Natalie's in the UK, on something like a Friday night there. So I think that the bandwidth was all getting taken up with people who were watching Netflix on that Friday night. And part of that was damaging to the sound quality. So I do apologize for that. We have to work with what we've got. And I still think that the content that Natalie had in that episode is really great. But one of the things we didn't get to was something called The Feast of the Swan. And this is a really interesting episode from 1306. So this is the time of Edward I. And if you don't remember who Edward I is, he is Edward Longshanks, the guy with the long legs. He's featured in Braveheart. He's the guy that was trying to take over, did conquer Wales, was also trying to conquer Scotland, and didn't manage that before he died, but left that kind of in process when he died. So that's Edward I. And Natalie talks about the Feast of the Swan being a moment during which Edward needed a whole bunch more knights to go and fight Robert the Bruce. So how is he going to make all these knights? Well, he had a feast and he knighted them all at the same time. And then he also got his son, Edward, the future Edward II, to knight people. But what was wacky about this particular feast is that they had 2 golden cygnets, so baby swans there, in front of which they made their vows to fight Robert the Bruce. And this is kind of a strange thing, I think, to make your vows in front of 2 golden cygnets. It has a weird biblical vibe to it. You're not really supposed to be, swearing vows in front of something that could be construed as an idol. I mean, especially a gold thing. But this is something that was done in 1306. And I'm just going to read a little bit from Natalie's book so that you can see what this was like, the Feast of the Swan. And for the people who are watching on video, you can see things that I couldn't share on the podcast. One of them being that Natalie's book introducing the medieval swan, like introducing the medieval ass, in the corner it has like a flip book. So I'm going to put this close to the microphone so people listening can hear. But you can see a swan flying in the corner of the book, which is pretty amazing. Okay, back to the Feast of the Swan. So this is May 1306, getting ready to fight Robert the Bruce again. And Natalie's quote from the book is from the Flores Historiarum, and it says, "Then 2 cygnets or swans ornamented with golden nets or gilded pipings were brought in showy splendor before the king, an agreeable spectacle, to those looking on. Having looked at them, the king vowed a vow to God in heaven and the cygnets, or swans, that he purposed to set out for Scotland to avenge the injury done to Holy Church, the death of John Comyn, and the broken faith of the Scots, dead or alive. Thereupon the other nobles bound themselves by the same oath, affirming in good faith that they were prepared to set out for Scotland with the king while he lived, and after his death with the prince his son, in order to fulfill the royal vow." So there's some stuff there that you might remember from the medieval podcast I did with Ian McInnes talking about the death of John Comyn. But the interesting thing here is that they were eating swans at the feast. They decorated 2 up in gold and swore some vows to them in order to get themselves motivated to go and fight the Scots. Really interesting stuff, I think. And apparently, according to Natalie, this is one of the first instances that inspired other people to make other vows to other birds at other feasts, which is really kind of an interesting medieval thing and something that I didn't get to talk about with her on the medieval podcast. Now, this kind of makes sense in a way for Edward I because Edward was a guy who was really big into symbols. He himself was named after Edward the Confessor instead of being named after his dad. His dad is Henry III. He named Edward after his favorite saint, Edward the Confessor. And so Edward was really big into symbolism. When he was conquering Wales, one of the things that he did was he reburied the bodies of two people who were conveniently found at Glastonbury Abbey. So while he's conquering Wales, they just happened to come across the bodies of King Arthur and Guinevere. And so Edward, being canny, decides he's going to bury them. And he's ostensibly doing this to show respect for this great ancestor, King Arthur. But at the same time, he's trying to conquer the Welsh. And he's putting their best hope, the once and future king, in the ground. And he's putting a stone over him to show the Welsh that nobody is coming to help them. So Edward is a guy who's really into symbolism. As Natalie mentions in introducing the medieval Swan, he is supposed to be a descendant of the Swan Knight. So he's got that symbolism going for him. And he has this really interesting feast called the Feast of the Swan, at which there are lots of birds eaten. I don't know if they were eating there. Lots of birds eaten, including 1,000 chickens. So that is pretty impressive if you ask me. So keeping with an animal theme, because perhaps this is an easy thing to do, is to keep to a theme. One of the other things I wanted to talk about, because I'm telling you that there's great stuff happening in articles, is an article which is actually done online by Krista Murchison, and that was on medieval guide dogs. So I've alluded to this before, but here I'm going to point you directly to it. It is kristamurchison.com/medieval-guide-dogs. And this is such a cool article because she was digging for images of guide dogs being used in the Middle Ages. We know that they were being used, but where do you find them? And she's found more than one really amazing image of a person who is being led by a guide dog. And there's lots of cool stuff about this that Krista gets into in the article. One of them being that the blind people in the pictures are being led by dogs who have bowls. What does this mean? Usually people who are disabled in the Middle Ages, and if you remember, I did a podcast about this way at the beginning with Keisha Tracy, people with disabilities could easily be people who are destitute because they couldn't work for themselves. And if they didn't have family, they would have to resort to begging. In part, this could be because they were a blind person who had the misfortune of being alone. I think that it's logical to assume that many people who are visually impaired in the Middle Ages were being led and helped by people in their households, in their families who had vision. But sometimes it was because perhaps they didn't have family, and other times, as Krista says, it could be because their blindness comes from leprosy, which means that they are not going to be really integrated into society the way other people who might have visual impairments would be. So it makes sense for these people perhaps to be shown as being people that need to have the income that comes from begging or alms. So you can see them often with bowls, which is really interesting. What's cool about these guide dogs is they don't look like the guide dogs that we see today, in that over time we've really bred our dogs to look a certain way and to have certain attributes. But back in the day, they were kind of dogs, like a brown dog. It didn't have the same type of breed that we see today when we're looking at guide dogs. So that's another cool thing about these pictures, is you can see that your different dogs are definitely dogs, but it's hard to pinpoint what breeds they are because this is before people have had those generations of breeding programs to create the perfect guide dogs, who tend to be Labradors and Golden Retrievers. So that's a really interesting thing as well. And then she has a couple of quotes, Krista does, in this blog post, this article, where she talks about how some people thought that guide dogs were a good option, that they could become your eyes. And then some other people thought that they were not a good option because it's hard to train dogs well. This speaks to me because I am training a dog right now. He's doing really well. But do I want to trust him with my sight? Maybe not so much. So I want to point people to this article on medieval guide dogs because I think it gets at a lot of things that are important to medieval studies, making sure we include people who might have been on the margins, people with disabilities perhaps, people who are impoverished. That's really important. And then also seeing how people with disabilities, perhaps in the Middle Ages, had agency, and how did they have agency, and how did that work? The cleverness of medieval people, as you know, is something that I always want to highlight. So there is that. And then I think it's really great to see those pictures that you might not see elsewhere that show people who definitely have a visual impairment working with a guide dog. And if guide dogs are something that you like, then again, this is a space for me to talk about modern stuff as well. If you have Disney Plus, Pick of the Litter is a wonderful show. It's going to be the type of show that makes you cry every week, but it is a really cool show that shows you how these guide dogs are trained, how they're brought up, what they have to do in order to become guide dogs, some of the hurdles that they have to jump so that they can prove that they can be somebody's eyes and be that trustworthy. And so if you haven't seen that, I encourage you to watch it because it might give you some insight into thinking about the ways in which people train dogs and use dogs in the Middle Ages. And that is something that I'm always interested in. So here's me turning my page again. This is kind of an interesting style of podcast where it's like you get to sit in on a lecture with me if I could just talk about all the things that I think are interesting. Okay, I might edit out a couple of things, including having a dry mouth. But for now, we're just going to roll with it. So bringing it back to the modern world, because again, this is my jam, my wheelhouse, not just to think about people in the Middle Ages and cast my imagination back to the way that they thought about things, conceptualized things, and did things, but also looking at the medieval world from a modern perspective in terms of the research that we're doing today. So I wanted to bring a book to your attention from the modern world, which is super, super modern. I'm going to wave it in front of the camera for the people who are actually watching on video. It is called An Immense World by Ed Young. And this is a book that I got for Christmas, and I immediately became Olaf from Frozen 2. So if any of you are parents or you've seen Frozen 2, you know there is a part in it where this little snowman just spits facts constantly. Did you know? I think turtles can breathe through their butts or something like that. I became that person after reading this book. It's absolutely fascinating. And the author has won a Pulitzer before, so you know that the prose in it is really good. The research is really good. But this is the kind of fact I was spitting out at Christmas time. Did you know that bees can sense the magnetic fields of flowers? I did not know that. Did you know that elephants can communicate through infrasonic sounds? So elephants are making sounds under the ground that other elephants at a distance can hear. And did you know that sharks have sensors that pick up on electric fields in their snouts? So once they get close to their prey, they use like electricity to understand where their prey are. Like this is really fascinating stuff. Oh, my favorite picture in it probably is there's a picture of a corgi, coming back around to dogs again, where it has a picture in color in the type of trichromatic color that most of us see, right? So 3 different colors, the RGB thing. And then it has a picture of what the corgi sees with dichromatic vision. So the people who are colorblind see perhaps like this corgi in dichromatic vision. And this is so fascinating to me. I came back to this picture over and over and over again because I wanted to understand. So this book, An Immense World, tells you so much about the world that we can't perceive. So things that are infrasonic, infrared, things that have to do with magnets and heat and all of those things. The amazing ways in which animals sense the world. As a medieval scholar, of course, it comes back to history for me. So I'm thinking about things like, how did people observe animals back in the day? And I think Natalie Goodison, talking about medieval swans, talked about Gregory the Great. No, it wasn't Gregory the Great. It was Albertus Magnus, and how closely he observed the swans, what they did every year, how they came back to the same places, what they did with their young, all of these things. And if you read a bestiary, as I was talking with Natalie about, you know that there's a lot of allegory in it, right? This animal is like Christ in this way. So many animals are, if you read these books. But there's also all of this observation. And when I think about the way in which people were observing, for example, dogs, and noticing that they could hear things that people can't hear, how can that be used? How can that be manipulated, perhaps? How can that be accessed and used to help people have an easier life, a better time? And when we think about the ways in which medieval people's world was just so heavily integrated with those of animals, I think that the more we can learn about the ways in which animals sense the world, the more it informs what we can think of when we look back to history. So if we know that bees can sense the magnetic fields of flowers, next time we look at bees in a medieval manuscript, or we look at the ways in which monks took care of them, or in which they created honey, for example, what can we learn that might help us understand the ways, perhaps, that monks understood the behavioral patterns of bees, for example? It's also just a really awesome book if you want to be that Olaf person in your family who is talking about, did you know that bees can sense magnetic fields? So this book, An Immense World, is one that I just want to share with more people. And I think that you can be a better student of history the more you read broadly, which, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing is a point that I make in How to Live Like a Monk. The more broadly you read, just like medieval monks thought, the more you can understand concepts that are narrow. So I'm always reading, and I encourage you all to read widely as well and see how it influences, I was going to say interprets, how it influences your study of history. At this point, I'm thinking, now you know what it's like when I don't edit myself. You get all the unbridled enthusiasm, and sometimes it means I need to stop and rethink a word. But again, I'm doing this in part to show you that it's okay to be so enthusiastic that you can make a mistake, and people will be all right with it. Okay, coming back around to animals, and one of the things that I want to keep doing in the format for Extra Medieval is to talk about things that are perhaps closely related to culture or dates. So today, the day that this podcast comes out, is the feast day of Frances of Rome, who is an abbess who is the patron saint of widows, which I think is really interesting. And so I looked up who is a patron saint of swans, and that is Hugh of Lincoln. Apparently he had a little swan that liked him quite a lot. The patron saint of dogs is Saint Roch, who was a French saint. And I didn't have time to go too closely into his story, but it's an odd one because they talk about him having dealt with the Black Death, and the dates that I found for him are too early for that. So it's an interesting one. Perhaps more of you will look into Saint Roch and tell me what you find out about him. But if you love dogs, your patron saint of dogs is Saint Roch. One of the things that I didn't get to talk about today is that International Women's Day is March 8th. I didn't get to create a podcast around International Women's Day for International Women's Day, but don't worry. Not only have I been talking about women with experts quite a lot in the first couple months of this year, but next week I will be speaking with Dr. Eleanor Yanniga, everybody's favorite guest, who is going to be talking about her new book, The Once and Future Sex. So if you are interested in women's history, don't worry, I got you covered. Every day is Women's Day. We will be talking about the once and future sex on the next episode of the Medieval Podcast. So This was an experiment. It was the first episode, the pilot episode of Extra Medieval, in which I just chat to you about stuff I find interesting about the medieval world. So if this is your jam and you want to get subscribed to Extra Medieval, it's going to be available to you on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on Patreon. I'm going to see if I could bring the videos to YouTube more broadly, but that is something that I need to learn how to do. When I first started podcasting, I had no idea how to do it. This is similar. I am starting something new with no idea how to do it, but sometimes you just got to jump in with both feet and get started. So I hope that you've enjoyed this episode, that you'll join me for Extra Medieval, and next week it's going to be back to your regularly scheduled medieval podcast, edited, clean, and all of that stuff, and it's going to be with Dr. Eleanor Yanega talking about the once and future sex. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. Well, I've got an interesting piece that I did. It's called Differences Between Christians and Muslims in the Middle Ages. So there's a bit of a backstory to it. Way back when I was just the editor of the De Re Military website, I came across this text by a Franciscan friar. He was writing in 1485. He writes this kind of guide to the Holy Land. And it's a pretty big genre. There's tons and tons of other stuff like that. But what I found really interesting was, besides he had a lot of observations and firsthand views of what's happening in Egypt and Syria, he creates this list. He calls it the contrasts, where he tries to figure out what the difference is between like an Italian Christian like himself and the Muslims more or less in Egypt. That's where he's basing this all off of. So I really found this an incredibly fascinating list. Stuff like, we write from left to right. They write from right to left. They drink water. We drink wine. They used the moon for their calendar. We use the sun. But it was something I read and I thought was really fascinating at a time. And then I totally lost track of it. For many years, I was kicking myself. Where is this text? I go to the University of Toronto Library and try and find it, spend hours fruitlessly searching the stacks for it. But just in the last couple of weeks, I came across an old computer file that had references to it. Oh, yes, finally. So I was able to track down the book, a translation from the 1940s, and I came across it and I started working on this. And I had a lot of difficulty just trying to kind of write the piece about it. And I want to thank you. You offered a lot of help looking it over for me and giving me suggestions, because it's a very tricky piece. We're talking about religious relations, things like that. How he's saying his stuff is not a totally unbiased view we have here, right? But I'm glad that I was able to put that out for personal reasons, but I also think it's a really fascinating look at how medieval people saw the world. Mm-hmm. So again, thanks so much for helping out with that piece.
Well, I don't think I did much except for to say, be careful, because a Franciscan is going to be really insulting in ways that we may not understand. So when you read this piece, understand the many, many layers, many of which could be very negative. But also there are some things in that article that talk about neutral things, which are interesting. But yeah, to look back on something that long ago means you have to read it with extreme sensitivity. So I don't think I did anything beyond saying, hey, Peter, make sure that you are sensitive when you put this out.
That's usually enough for me. Like, hey, put it up there without like any context at all. So the best part is, and it's the part that I always remember, was the Franciscan says, we like dogs and they like cats.
It sticks out in your mind because you like cats.
I'm a cat lover. You are a dog lover.
Yeah, for sure.
So we have that. Plus, we have some news on the search for a medieval ship that's apparently under a pub in England.
Well, yeah.
as usual. And we also know that the construction has started on the Museum of the Viking Age in Norway.
Nice.
So in 2026, go to Oslo, because there's going to be this fancy new museum. The designs is going to be incredible. Ground just got broken earlier this month. So we have a news piece on that as well.
Awesome. Well, that is a whole bunch of interesting stuff. Thank you, Peter, for letting us know what's on the website.
And thanks so much for creating the Extra Medieval podcast. I'm looking forward to hearing it myself.
Me too. All right. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you, as always, to all of you patrons on Medievalist.net's Patreon page, whose generosity helps to support the Medieval Podcast and the work of other indie writers and podcasters who contribute to their website. Patrons can access all sorts of goodies like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as ad-free versions of the Medieval Podcast and Extra Medieval. To become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from crossovers to crossroads, follow Medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Sobalski, on social media at 5MIN-Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life, in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an extra special day.